people in the discussion that we are having now in our fight against the violence towards women and teenagers. This person who does not need to be further introduced, but well, here she is, Ana Paula Araújo, a journalist and writer of the book Abuse, the Culture of Rape in Brazil. Anna, welcome. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for everything that you have done, all the stories that you have brought to light, the history of so many women in the book that you have written. I'm really honored to be here with you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you as well, to join forces in this fight that we have for so long. And I see that this is a very positive chance that we have to join forces. Yes, that's correct. Unfortunately, I believe that we'll still talk about this subject for long, but here we are now in order to expedite things and perhaps shorten this time. The second very dear friend that I'd like to invite is someone I'm friend with that is also a psychologist. She's a doctor in clinic psychology and forensic psychology. She got her degree at the University of Kent, and she's a researcher and a major reference in Brazil for the discussion of many subjects related to violence against women, teenagers, and children. Welcome, welcome in our conversation. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It is a great pleasure to be here with you to discuss about this subject. This is a delicate subject, but an important one. It is always an urgent issue. Even though time goes by, we notice that it is an urgent issue to discuss, and I hope that we have an interesting conversation. Yes, that's correct. We are going to have a conversation here. So please feel at ease so that, and all of you who are following us, please send questions so that we can have a conversation. We want, with this time that we have assigned to us, you will see that it will go by flying. But anyway, during this time we are together, let's try to move beyond page 2. We understand now that sexual violence in Brazil is a problem. It is a problem in view of the subnotification. It is a problem because we don't understand completely what it is. And it is a problem because we don't know how to deal with it. So we know it is a problem. And then what do we do with it? The idea of going through this journey that we are going now is trying to touch on 4 major issues. The first one is, what are the major subjects we face? The second important issue is talking about traumas. How can we deal with it, and what are the traumas we have in these cases, and what are the sizes, the dimensions these things take place in the life of people? Thirdly, we have the issue of who are the authors of this violence. What is the relation of these authors of the violence with the victims? And finally, we want to talk about what is the role we have. We are in a meeting of public security, so most of the people who are talking and watching work in a field, but the public security field cannot deal with this issue alone. So what are the other roles that we must take up so that we can face these subjects? So in order to start, I'd like to invite Arielle. Could perhaps tell us what are the major subjects and what cannot be out of our radar when we talk about sexual violence in Brazil? Well, I believe that this question is fundamental so that we can start this discussion. I'd like to make a comment about public security because it has a conversation with that, has a conversation with the need, with a broader view. We come from a tradition of fighting against violences that are very much based on the punishment, when we talk about fighting against violence with this oppressive logic, without making certain connections that miss the interactions that contribute to the case of violence. This is a complex, a systemic problem, and that goes beyond many other areas that are not only public security. So we must have trained and qualified public security agents to deal with this kind of crime. When talking about sexual violence, we think about rape, but there are many other practices. It can involve the trafficking of women, online forms of harassment. So we are talking about a series of other practices that not necessarily are practices we are ready to fight against. So thinking about that, if we broaden our view, we are talking about education, we are talking about public health. Violence is a problem of public health as well, so we must have a broader view with the community health agents who are fundamental people since they are in contact with the population. We are talking about gender education at schools. We are talking about financial empowering of women who are often victims of these cases of violence, very often because of the financial dependence. So we must think about our fight against sexual violence. How can we as society have been working and not only looking through these lenses of justice? Great. I'd like you to, well, I believe that one of the main barriers that prevent us from dealing with this issue is the lack of knowledge on the types of violence. So I'd like you to talk. Well, when we talk about sexual violence, are we talking about rape only? Let me just pay attention that I'm not talking with my microphone muted. Well, when we talk about sexual violence, we are talking about any act or attempt that happens through violence or coercion. So here we must understand that we are talking about trying to commit an act or obtain sexual favors through coercion or physical violence. So not necessarily, we are not talking about someone who uses physical force to obtain sexual contact. When we talk about sexual violence, we talk about intimate touches that are not desired, like touching, grabbing, harassing, kissing, comments with a sexual approach, certain kinds of jokes, and comments like that. These are sexual violations too. Being forced to touch someone else's body, or being obliged to watch sexual relation that someone else is having, forcing people to prostitute themselves, rape inside marriage and outside marriage, sexual harassment at work. This is a practice that we know, and people who work in the area know it better, but overall people don't have so much knowledge about it. But there is also the online grooming that can happen mostly to children and teenagers, that is about grooming people through the internet. Usually there's an adult man that pretends to be a teenager or a child to have access to pictures or videos or even the personal contact. And we have so many other practices that could be included in the definition of sexual violence. That could even include the lack of access to preservatives or contraceptives in a marriage. So any given act where there is no consent, when there is no consent, and in parallel, there is a practice or intention to practice sexual abuse, we are talking about sexual violence. Excellent. Anna, in your book, you wrote several reports, and you try to bring the different dimensions of how rape is present in the life of women. I'd like you to tell us. I believe that you bring the practical example of all these forms of violence that Arielle has just told us. So please, tell us, why did you decide to write this book? I think it's interesting to know, why do we join this discussion? And second, what has drawn most your attention in regards to these cases of sexual violence? You could bring some examples so that we can materialize, because sometimes it can be very abstract. So it would be interesting to hear from you. Marfu, just to complement what Arielle said, all this wider scope of sexual violence, that is part of our law. I think it's interesting to talk here at this very event. And know that since 2009, the concept became much more wide. So in the past, that was the forced sexual relationship. And now the law encompasses undesired touches. There are articles that also refer to people who touch other people inside public transportation. And in the past, there was a lot of lack of knowledge inside the public security agencies. I have seen many cases that were reported with violent attempt, and that is something that no longer exists since this update to the legislation. So we must disclose what the law really says, what the law really provides, what are the concepts of sexual violence that the law provides. So these are guidelines that point to how we should work with these occurrences in the scope of public security. I wanted to write this book because I got to the conclusion that that is part of the life of every woman. We can say for ourselves that since our teenage years, we have been through unpleasant experiences, undesired touches, and that pressure that we feel, women must take care of themselves. So we have this thing in our mind. And well, what about the men? Shouldn't they be given the right education and know how to respect women? So, well, no, we have always felt this oppressive charge that we are the ones to blame. Well, you didn't behave as you should. You didn't take the necessary precautions, or why were you there? What were you doing there? So that reflects on the service that is given in the public health and public security. We are part of the same society. So when these cases get to these places where victims should be embraced, what we see is a reproduction of the prejudice and these demands that are completely baseless, and try to put the blame on the victims. In regards to the other question you made, what drew my attention was this: one of the many discoveries I made throughout many interviews were about the lack of attention from the government agencies. Sometimes they are even more hurtful than the sexual violence itself. I interviewed a woman, and when she was 17, she was approached by a thief, and this guy took her to a corner and raped her. And finally, she was able to report that. She went to the police agency. She went through that very painful journey of going and have a physical examination and coming back and telling the story once again and talking to a public health agent. It took her a lot of time, because she finally did what everyone told her she should do. When she made the report, she found out later that she was pregnant. To summarize, she was able to have an abortion, a legal abortion, which is provided by law. Sometime after, this rapist was arrested. And when the case was sent to the courts, he said that he had a sexual relationship with her, but that was consensual. And the judge, a woman, admitted this hypothesis that she was pregnant, and she decided to have a physical relationship with a thief so that she could have a legal abortion. I mean, completely baseless. And she got very very angry about that. She tried to have a new sentence, and I found her when she was about to hear the new judgment, but she wanted to tell about her case, about the justice, what was done to her, how she had to fight to change her status. And when I asked her, do you feel more angry about the judge or the rapist? And she said that she's much more angry with the judge because the judge had an education, the judge should have embraced her. And when I asked her about the final decision of the court, she didn't even know because she wasn't so much caring about that, but she was caring about the injustices that she found when she went to the courts. So the lack of embracing from the courts, from the police agencies, the lack of credit, the lack of embracing from her own family, all these cases, they represent a second violence, and sometimes they are even much more hurtful than the sexual violence case itself. Well, that's absolutely very important because there's a question that we have that touches on that point. This process begin at our difficulty of understanding the complexity of the problem. So the logic is, if the woman was raped, then what should we do? If it were as simple as that, okay, you have been through a case of sexual violence, you report it, and then things will be solved. But people don't understand that the logic are based on a conceptual foundation, and that foundation implies a certain lack of equality, and there's a prejudice against women in it. So this logic that you mentioned, that try to blame the woman, and that is something that keeps on carrying forward this injustice. If we don't understand this problem, we can't really translate things better. So I'd like you to tell us a little bit better. The narrative, it helps or hinders the building and how to find a solution to these cases of violence, and the embracing to these women who have been through cases of sexual violence. What have changed? What has changed in stories you heard that has helped women to face these problems? What were the narratives that were told? What did you see in certain situations? What are the most interesting processes that you could follow? Basically, the support from family and institutions. When this works out well, the recovery of the victim is absolutely much better than those victims who cannot speak to anyone, or when they talk to their family say, well, forget about it, that is part of the past. Or when they go to the police department, they feel discredited because this is a crime that is hard to get concrete evidence. So because of this mechanism, this ridiculous mechanism of blaming the victim and making the victim feel ashamed, I usually say that rape is the only crime in which the victim is blamed and feels ashamed for it. So, for instance, evidences that could be there and could help in the process, they are gone. Signs of a struggle, they are hard to find sometimes. Not to mention the delay in having a medical assistance, because if you don't have the abortion pill, you can have problems then. So these are problems that affect victims. To illustrate an example of how institutions and family help, I have one example of the case that happened in the state of Piauí, Morro do Castelo. A very famous case. There were four girls who went up this hill to take pictures and were raped. That was a barbarous crime. They were thrown from the cliff. One of them died. I interviewed one of the survivors, and I mean, how can you survive such a horror? They spent hours as kidnapped by these criminals. They were beaten. One of them died. The one that survived spent weeks in hospital, went through several surgeries, and the girl was doing well. She was studying to try to apply for a university. And when I talked to her more recently, she had been admitted to university. She got a boyfriend. She was able to get married, and she was able to get into a relationship, because many victims have many problems in getting into relationships. So I was really impressed when I was there to interview her. I imagined that I could find a girl who could not speak very well, but no, she could speak fluently. She was able to tell her story, and I realized that, first of all, she was with her mother by her side all the time. Her father, her brother could help her. She had to move, and she moved with her mother's. And since the case had a major repercussion, there was a great mobilization for her. She got some scholarships to study in better places. All these things helped her to stand up again. So she went through that terrible experience, but that didn't define her life forever. And she now has a life in despite of that. That made me really happy and drew my attention to the importance of the family embracing the victim. And when that happens, it's great. Not when the family asks, but why did you go there? Are you sure that happened? And that should also happen at the police departments. When I asked to this girl, and she said that she found that rapist walking in the street, and he had been released from prison, and she accidentally found him on the street. And I asked her, what did you feel? And she said, well, God has given me, she's religious, so she said, God has given me the gift of forgiving. I felt that has been through my life and it's part of the past. So I asked her, don't you feel any remorse or anything like that? And she said, yes, I feel some grief and remorse towards the public attorney, because he asked me this: were you girls there up the cliff just to take pictures, really, for real? So that was the only remorse, the only grief that she kept. The way the public attorney talked to her, the demand, the attempt of trying to victimize her. So I found it interesting, because this girl back then, she was 16 years old, and she was able to fight back. She was, able to defend herself. Many victims can't. Many victims try to explain themselves, and then they feel that they shouldn't be there. They begin to internalize this blame. That is cruel. That has to stop. And that should be mentioned here in this meeting with public security agencies. It is really important to embrace the victim, respect the victim, and treat the victim as a victim and not as a suspect who could be inventing, creating, or trying to gain any advantage from such an absurd situation. A situation in which no one would want to be in. Sorry for the microphone. I'd like to add a comment here. It would be interesting. Maybe you could comment to us. These are very important topics that have been mentioned, maybe in your view as a psychologist. Yes, Anna touched on many points. When we deal with cases of sexual violence, especially when we deal with cases of rape, there is this stereotype of this sexual violence. We have an expectation of those who can be the authors, those who are the victims, how the victim was harassed, and how the victim can react to that. So when Anna went to interview the girl, and she thought that she was going to interview a girl who had difficulty to talk about that, so that's an idea that we have. And all of these stereotypes, we find them everywhere. These agents who work in the public security, they have an expectation of how was the crime, who is the author, who is the victim. So when we find a girl or a woman who has an attitude that are different from the ones that we feel the actions should be, so we start to doubt. So we have sometimes the woman that can be understood as theatrical or hysterical when she cries, or the woman that will be understood as a liar or indifferent if she doesn't cry. And if she takes very long to look for help, and that's because she was planning something else. So we create narratives to justify the behavior of the victim, regardless of the way that she acts. We must understand that there is no typical or perfect behavior. There are many behaviors and they are variable. There are victims who have an immediate condition of reporting on what happened for a series of reasons. And there are women who take years to understand that they have been victims of a crime. So we must understand that the attitude from the judiciary when they are dealing with such cases, sometimes we feel that the best narrative wins, but not the true story. So we must understand that it is possible sometimes the narrative to turn the places around and put the victim as the criminal. So this construction of this narrative and this speech sometimes does not place as the center point the the violence itself, but the reputation, the history of that woman, as if these things were a justification to the case of sexual violence. So, and we know that women that go through cases of collective rape tend to be even more victimized and blamed than those who are victims of individual rape. So it's not the violence of the crime, but the behavior and the suspicion about the behavior of that woman. So we must think all the time, not on what we are building in terms of narrative, but how we are preparing the spaces for embracing, for receiving and directing this kind of demand. Because in practice, what we find is a reproduction of a series of speeches and narratives that are almost as violent as the cases of sexual violence they go through. I like to comment on something that Arielle said, just very quick things. I mentioned the case of this judge that believed this hypothesis of consensual relationship with this girl that wanted to have an abortion. I interviewed this judge and she said that to me, yeah, back then I could not feel a lot of consistency in her report. She couldn't tell things right. And I felt that she had a very cold behavior. So interesting point. The criminal made lots of contradictions, but she preferred to privilege his report than her report. Another interesting point is this. We have had a very recent change in law. Up to the year 2005, there was the figuring law of the honest woman. The rape was committed against the honest woman. So there is this conception of the victim, her behavior, her profile. So this is a recent change. And just like all these recent changes, these things should be internalized and work on better in the imaginary of everyone. Gosh, that's really important. When the best narrative wins, I think this is the first issue in the imaginary. We are talking about 15 years. It's been 15 years that we have had this change on what is the honest woman, because that's still part of the people's imaginary. I have seen today a post on the internet that says how many women are necessary to put the word of a man in doubt. In regards to Marcus Millian, he was reported committing sexual violence by 35 victims. There were many others who were reported by lots, sometimes even hundreds of women that have suffered violence from them. So sometimes it's not even the best narrative that wins, but how is it possible in the most brutal crime, like let's say a collective rape, people sometimes may say, well, if you were there, so you deserved it. So it's a complete reversal of logic. It's interesting that we understand that, understand the complexity of the problem. Otherwise, we, as public agents, we must know how to dive deeper. And if we don't do that, we end up reproducing all these prejudices. And that's not because we are evil, but we must leave this logic of us against them. I have really appreciated how the forum has worked on this idea of building bridges. We must leave this position of us against them and somehow think of ourselves as part of the problem. Otherwise, we won't be able to be part of the solution. Well, there are many questions here. Let me get two of these questions and ask you. So the first question is by Severino, and he says, what are the consequences of chauvinism in Brazil related to sexual violence? And there is a question by Gabriela in which she says about how to work with men. So she asks about the possibility of the rehabilitation of the criminal. And so I'd like to bring up these two dimensions that bring these views so that we can understand that violence against women is not a problem of the women themselves. So Arielle, could you start? And then Anna, you could bring your comments, okay?
Okay. I can't hear Arielle. Hello? Hello.
So these are sociopaths, these are frustrated men and men who suffer from other issues. But in practice, what we see, these are men who felt authorized to commit these acts of violence. These were men that, in view of the context they live in, they feel that they can and they must, or they should act violently, because sometimes either we don't acknowledge these acts as violence, or even though these crimes are recognized, we create justifications that pose the man not as a criminal. And the man can say, well, I didn't do anything wrong, like this. Well, she has drunk a little bit more than the usual, so I took my chances. So taking your chances is sexual violence. The woman could not consent to the relation, and that is rape. So we create different names and definitions. We smoothen the severity of the case and create reasons, justifications for these behaviors to keep on happening. So the relation between chauvinism and sexual violence is straight and direct. So we cannot dissociate them, because when we say that women are obliged to have sexual relationship with their partners, we contribute to sexual violence inside the relationship. So likewise, we are not talking about any deviation of behavior that is pathological. There is no possibility, sometimes in very specific cases, when we talk about serial killers or people who have a very particular action mechanism, But overall, we not only can, but we should think about this work with criminals that have committed any act of sexual violence, especially the preventive approach. I agree completely with Arielle has said, and she has also helped me a lot through the researches for my book. But I'd like to draw our attention to 2 points. One is what Arielle said. Well, the woman has had a little more than the usual drink, and then the man goes and takes the chance. And that is related to the rape of vulnerable people. So it can occur when we have minors. Minors are not able to give their consent. If they are 13, they can't. If something happens, that is a rape, that's a crime. And the same applies to people who are in situation in which they cannot state their consent. People with cognitive problems, locomotion problems, or people who have consumed drugs or drinks and are able to give their consent. We have seen in the media a case with a football player who said, well, that girl, she had no idea of what was happening. But yeah, that is the case. She had no way to give her consent, to authorize, or even to defend herself. So then it comes to the equation, well, she had taken drugs or she had drunk, but if she was not aware, she had no conditions, that is rape, period. Another point I'd like to make is, when you made that comment on the post, how many women are necessary to report? And I was reminding myself not only about João de Deus, but there was also a gymnastics coach who went through a historical trial in the US. I remember hearing from lots of people saying, well, that's not possible. How could he have committed that to so many girls? How could no one stand up and reported him? But well, that happened to the case of João de Deus. Lots of people reported him, but he was powerful, he was rich. So now we are going through a moment that we are perhaps seeing for the first time institutions giving more credit to victims. And what happens then? When one person makes a report, lots of other people feel encouraged to report as well. So we need as well to have embracing mechanism for victims. It's no good if the victims make their report, but feel that they are not trusted and are not embraced, and in the end makes no change, so they have to go through all this suffering. Can I add just a final comment? That is this. This is an important piece of information. When we talk about reporting harassment or sexual violence, there is the counter argument that says, well, lots of women makes these reports to take revenge. And there are many women who make false reports. So I go to the academic figures that we have. All the literature we have points that the number of misleading or false accusations is very low, doesn't reach 5%. In practice, what we find is that reporting a case of sexual violence demands strength, courage, search for help, and that's not something that people do by revenge or any other reason, excepting very rare exceptions. So that cannot be used. We cannot use a case where there was a misleading accusation, using that as a rule, and then neglect the care to women who have found up strength and courage to make these reports. So we must have this information in our minds in order not to victimize again these women. Let me just add another comment, and it's this: when the victims are children, there is this trend sometimes of thinking, well, the child has made up that from her mind. That is, misleading. But children basically never lie about cases of sexual violence. I have been to many psychologists, and they have told me the only case when a child can invent are when they are being manipulated by one of the parents. But even though there are mechanisms that psychiatrists can get to understand if that is a lie or if that is something that was forced into the child by one of the parents, or if the child has any cognitive problem, maybe they have watched a movie and maybe starts to fantasize. But children basically don't lie when they talk about sexual violence. When they make any kind of comment, that should be taken very seriously, investigated. Great. We must talk about children. Maybe that should be set apart so that we can have a specific topic, because we are talking about a very high number. 70% of victims are below the age of 14. So I'd like to make two comments here. Actually, this is a mention made by Alessandra in regard to the case of the football player Robinho that shows how much the narrative. This is the best example of everything that should not happen. He confessed, he was judged, he was condemned, but well, even then, the girl was to blame. So it's such an aberration that, I mean, it's surreal. So we must talk about what we should do and what we should not do when it comes to public security, as people who work in the justice sphere and people who want to be agents for the transformation of the system, because so far the system has been made not to work to the favor of women. One of the questions that was made, let me find, I will try to find it later, but it touches on the importance of making this distinction. How can you work on the subject, but how can you bring up this subject when you talk about the outskirts of the cities, the more vulnerable areas? And we need to understand that there is this organization of organized crime, really, that grooms these little girls. So these discussions should take place. How do you look at the issue of sexual violence, understanding that white women are different from black women? So should we have this differentiation? Is this fundamental for our discussion? I'd like to complement this question, making a connection to traumas. I think it is important for us to understand what is helpful, what is a hindrance for overcoming these events. First, knowing about traumas and how to overcome them. Okay, let me start then. So it is key that when we talk about sexual violence against women, we should understand that there are many women in their diversities of belief, of race, ethnicities. We are reducing them to a single group, as if we all belong to the same experience in the world. So that's not the case. So we must look at these differences. That's fundamental for us to propose the services.
But to fake that that variable does not exist is not a solution. Now, we have to see that in every year there's an increase in the cases of violence. Is violence increasing, or is it that we're just reporting more? Well, both things are happening. We have notions that we're still legitimizing a number of types of violence, and there's a number of variables. For example, the way the Afro-descended woman has been pictured in culture in general, for example, the mulatta in Carnival, you know, it's not just the social violence also, it's technically domestic violence. There's this concept that women are stronger and they feel less pain. Can you imagine? At the delivery of the child, for example. So and rustic black women are considered very rustic, so they can stand pain. You know, all these stereotypes, they go across our sight, our vision of a woman, and so we can't think of a solution for her. I can't think of the care to a child that is a victim of sexual violence in the same way I think as into different children, one that is rich, one that is poor. For example, pregnancy sometimes for a child, for a young, very young woman, is sometimes the only way to get saved from all this violence. It's a kind of a protection in the status within her group. So before we moralize some practices, we have to think of preventions that might be coherent to the public and the space with which we're working. That done without a kind of an opinion of hierarchy that we are high above them, you know. So let me see that if yeah, let me see you because I understand you. But there should be a view of these people that is horizontal. And when we talk about traumas, we have to think on how these special sexual violence experiences behave. These women cannot verbalize for asking for help. They can't get to the spaces where they can be helped. For example, lesbians who are victims of social sexual abuse, or prostitutes, because they sell their body and they lose the status of being a victim because it's their fault and their guilt, you know. So we have to know these realities to understand the impact of sexual violence, to take interventions, to make interventions. So there should be a consistency in the declaration they do facing the authorities. So authorities should consider this something to be expected. They aren't verbally apt sometimes, and they think it's just inside a trauma also. So they have no capacity to ask for help or not to understand the facts in a chronological, ordered way. These things have to be considered. There's a number of impacts, you know, traumas after rape, post-rape, mutilation, a number of symptoms that have to be considered when we take the statements of these women so that we can take care of them. Great, very good. Anna, as you were talking about that, I remembered the several realities that we can see along Brazil. I've traveled to several places. For example, in the Marajó Island, it's very common to exploit sexually, children sexually. Sometimes 4 or 5-year-old children that get inside some boats that go by in exchange of food or a little kerosene, or they're very absurd situations, very different. But what calls my attention is to think that even though we have victims, in fact, the fact that we have victims of all kinds, of all social classes, what calls the attention is the root of those crimes, is the macho base of men. And that harms the idea that we throw the victim into guilt, you know, she provoked it and so on. There's no standard victim. But there's no standard victim, really. And there's no attacker that is standard. You know, sometimes it's the household mainstay that abuses, you know. Rapers that act like this go by as normal parents, normal men, to face any kind of accusation against them. And the victims also have variable profiles. These cases that happen in Marajó, well, it's a miserable place anyway. So exploitation, abuse in the family is a consensus things there, you know, and it's not because of misery there, because of poverty. It happens among high class or middle class. So it's very complicated situations of families that do not denounce abuse, you know. So we have to reach high class and low and middle class victims that have resources for therapy, psychotherapy, and deal with that trauma. But many times they repress the pain of sexual violence. I believe that we have to deal with the assistance to victims. That's very necessary, of course, but we have to work in prevention in general, so that these crimes do not happen, so that we change the mentality that woman is a property of a man, and that is what's in the root of all the problems. I would like to complement that, something that Anna said about children in a situation of vulnerability that are victims of some kind of violence or exploitation, of abuse. When we see a violence in a situation of violence, we become more indignated than when a woman, an adult woman, is a victim of a violence. But at the time of taking care of that child, we tend to turn against the mother, as if the mother let the child was put into a situation of vulnerability. Many times we don't know that this woman is also a victim of violence, or was a victim of violence. So there is a generational transition of this vulnerability. I'm not exempting the woman who is the responsible person to take care of the child, yes, but we need to expand our view, not only for the assistance of that child, but also to understand what is the mother's situation in that place, what her history is, and how she permitted, between inverted commas, that this history doesn't pass over to the child with this discourse to moralize and punish, perhaps, but won't change the reality. And and also the guilt of the rapist is always from on the part of the raper. And sometimes I saw a case in which the chief of police said that the children are paying a dear price for this exchange of stepfathers that went in and out of the house, throwing the guilt, throwing the culprit onto the mother of the child. That's very common. Mothers that for several times couldn't come to defend their children, their young girls, and with the excuse that the child seduced the stepfather. Many mothers are caught by surprise, don't know what's happening. And even those who, for some reason, did not defend their child, what is the cause for this non-defense? Why couldn't they react? We have to understand this. Something is happening under her nose. Well, I don't know what I do. There are about 10 questions here. There's only 20 minutes to go. And I don't know how we're going to do this, because I knew this was going to happen, but it's incredible. I'm following up with Twitter, several responses, and they say, wow, this is a very cool conversation. And really, you're very good at this. Thank you very much for being here. Now, there are 3 points that we have to fill in. One, how do we look to the inside of the institutions? There are several questions about that, but I would like us to stick to this problem of the children. There was the question by Caesar. How do you do when the mothers are apart? You didn't answer. You answered this very well. But Renata brings up an important question that has to do with children, because children are the ones that have most access to health systems. And there's the obligation of notification of sexual violence on account of the law, this 2020 law. Now, Bruno makes a comment also, a question about how do we deal with the discussion about sexual education if we have such a difficult process of this debate in public because of how we are now, the pandemics. So I would like to discuss about, to get to the final question, what do we do to inhibit sexual violence against children? I think you touched a lethal point. Sergio made the question, right? Well, I think it was Bruno and Renata about Cesar's comment. Well, sexual education is fundamental. We came to a point these days at the level of confusion that sexual education is bad for a child. And so, no. Education for prevention of sexual violence, because that's exactly what it deals with. To teach the child what are the intimate parts, who can touch them, when, and if there is some molesting touch, she has to be heard. And this has to happen in schools, because the great majority of these things happen inside the home. So the child has to have this channel of denouncing it in the school and being assisted to in schools. Also to teach what is consent. And of course, all this is adequate to the child, inadequate with withdrawal, so that the child is able to absorb it and take it into his or her life. You can mature the discourse to the child as it grows, but you have to take into account sexual education in schools. Many people talk about polemic things, like there are some people that think it's wrong to have sexual education, and yeah, there are many prejudices about this education. But who is interested in not having sexual education in school? Why not? Communities get together and everybody understand what is sexual education in school, and how important it is. I think this is fundamental to have. And I don't think this can be disconnected from the political choices that we do. And when I mean political, I don't mean the political parties, but how do we do policies? How do we practice policies? And how do we assume and interfere in public places, public spaces? How do we build them, especially as women? How do we put ourselves into these places and have our voice be heard? Because unfortunately, we've been talking more about the need for women to have more space, power, and so on, but we have to understand also to whom these women serve in these places, in these spaces. We can't look at the nowadays scenario in Brazil and the delays and the non-responses. We have sometimes budgets that are not invested, public budgets that are not invested, and the woman cannot make a decision. So we have to think of who these women are and who do they propose to take care of. Until these changes take long to be decided upon, and I'm an eternal I'm an eternal defender of small inside revolutions, participation into school networks, the supply of support, the supply of a consensus for the collectivity. And this is not a faraway problem for us. It is not a problem that is due to someone else, and this someone else would be social public security. For example, more police in the streets would be enough. No. Violence will continue to happen, even if you have more police in the streets. Violence happens against the police itself, so it's not an assurance that improvement will be there. Also, the obligatority of the compulsory notification, I have issues with that. We have to make a difference between notify and denunciation. So notification for statistics, to have control so that we generate data that should feed these discussions we're having, that's one thing. Now, if I pick up a violence case and I notify that case so that this serves to a data bank that we can generate information from, yes, it's necessary, but it's one thing. Now, the compulsiveness, the compulsive denunciation of violence, then we close the doors for that issue, because health, there is an entry. Women will have their intimacy exposed, so we're victimizing them. So notification and denunciation have to be treated in a different way. That's very important. We're not going to be able to discuss this, but Gabriela brought something as to closed schools for 9 months and thinking of school as a space for protection, because in the case of children, in fact, children are protected by teachers in schools and a place where children can talk about sexual violence. Is there any research, any survey that talks about what is the most dangerous place for women and what is the division? The home is the most dangerous place for women. We have data for that, yes. But you brought data about that. But how can we understand this space of protection, the schools? Because they're closed now. I saw some news today in Folha de São Paulo. Brazil, having closed the schools, is going against the tendency of all the countries during the pandemics, because even the lockdown countries have left the schools open. It's a very polemic discussions where they close or open schools. But what do you? Well, we have 12 minutes more, so 12 more minutes. So I'm trying to hold the theme here. If it's not the school to protect children, what do we do? Anna, would you like to begin? Well, it's all very non-typical for us. What is best, what is not, you know, in terms of health, in terms of protection, so many violences that are happening, you know. Apart from the contamination, we have all these worries to look at. In this case, with the pandemics and schools that are closed, as we said, the most dangerous place is the home for women and children. And the pandemics generated a situation of children being even more time with the aggressors. So if you pick up the statistics, in the beginning, the denunciations of sexual violence fell in the beginning of the pandemics, but very much because they couldn't make a denunciation, because the aggressor was there all the time and he wasn't coming out of the house too. So I think that we will still have some difference in the results to see the consequences of this pandemics and the staying at home thing. I have the same opinion as Anna, but I would like to add to a point that children do talk about sexual violence, but they talk with their behaviors. So I would like to strike the key again of the importance of training, reading about the issue, because just like a health agent that comes into the house of everybody because of the unified system health, you know, which is a asset for us, schools, teachers, whether it be private or public institutions, have daily access to these children and can understand when they have alterations of behavior. They have a regression of the behavior, they become more infantilized, childish, and or more sexualized behaviors. And myself, as a professional of education, have to be attentive to these signals. And I'd say, well, something wrong, something I have to deepen my look into it. But with closed schools, we lose that possibility. We lose the denunciation path, the path of acknowledging that there's something wrong, and even more, we lose the path of access to this family or to this child, because invariably, when there is sexual abuse, we also have a woman who's being the victim of abuse, whether it's in her property and sexually, and we have no way that we can just have access to the child, but to the family as a whole, and that woman especially. Very good. Well, we're coming to the end here, and I'd like to pick up the last part, which I found very important. And well, the problem is so big that I don't know where to begin from, so I won't begin from any place. There's a lot to do that each one of us can do from where we are, wherever we are in the country. So in the final considerations that you have, I wish that you would bring what can we do? We as agents of health agents, public security, justice agents, assistants, psychologists, as professionals in the public service. What can we do? And as professionals of the private organs too, what can we do? What is possible to be done in the different dimensions, the dimension of the individual, the institutional dimension, and the cultural dimension? Well, I believe that the first thing that we can do, and this is in the hand of each one and everybody at the same time, is to increase the assistance to children, to the victims, with no suspicions, listen to them, forward them to what they have a right to be forwarded to. I see some people, victims who come there and they think they have no rights, or they don't have access to the next day pill or some other kind of therapy. So there is an excess of victims sometimes, and this woman cannot make an abortion because of medical issues. I think there is a lack of this first aid. While the victim cannot break the silence, when she can break the silence and look for help, there can be no space for suspicion, prejudice, and lack of care. I think each one of us can do this, even if we're public agents. Sometimes not being a public agent, someone from my family. I have many cases that I have noticed of, that I have noted of people who are near my own life, and they see in myself, and the only person who heard without suspicion, without prejudice, and that is symptomatic. I've heard this report on their part. And then the victims become more encouraged to denounce, to overcome their traumas, and that's how it goes. When you have assistance, real embracement. I'd like to invite everybody who's here to hand over the message of self-knowledge before we think on how to generate miraculous strategies for the treatment. This is a solution that demands articulation between and among all institutions and different individuals. Self-knowledge is important for me. How do I, as a woman, have lived my sexuality? How myself as a woman have a story? What is my story? Where do I come from? Recognize myself in a macho society. How have I seen and treated other women? How have I heard and treated other men or men? And what do my silences talk about? When I shut up in the face of a provocation, when I judge the behavior of a woman, what does that mean? And how does that collaborate with my annuency, my consent? And for example, in WhatsApp, sometimes I share images that I don't really feel as they are. What are the jokes that I hear? Do I laugh? Do I not? Why do I laugh? Silence. What is it I don't say when a friend of mine tells me about his behavior with a woman, whether it's a known child or maybe I don't know her, but she's his girlfriend or wife. How do I behave before I demand anything as an institution? From an institution, we have to look inside. And how do we as individuals, as a particle of this enormous cosmos, how have we contributed for these violence items have happened, and how do they go on happening? I would like to reinforce these points that you brought up because they're very important, beginning from the one that you brought, which is the how we think that these things are far away from us. Each one of us has hundreds of dozens of histories. And I say, how did this happen to me? Because we rationalize discussion, and it is not a rational discussion. That's why it is important that if we cannot acknowledge ourselves, how can we understand how it affects us? when we naturalize violence that is not natural, we have to see that it's not natural to live with processes that bother us. Oh, because it's my marriage, it's like this. But social harassment is something that's very important. That happens very much in the workplace. And one person made a question about that. I think it was Fernando. I don't know if it was Fernando, but someone brought this question. How do we look to the inside of us? Because this violence happens within the institutions too. Women, in all their dimensions, in all their grades or posts of institutions, suffer violences, sexual harassments, sexual threats. We shouldn't naturalize this. It is not a normal thing. It doesn't part because you're in a hierarchy situation, such and such, you have to undergo these things naturally. No. Also, the hearing. Many times we hear, but we listen, but we don't hear. So this exercise has to be trained. We have to train our ears for that, because our first impetus, especially when we want to help, is to say, no, go there and do this, denounce, or do that, or do this. Because if it was me, I would do this. No, you wouldn't do it. I was talking to a victim of domestic violence, and she said, never again will I say if it was me. Because now that it happened to me, I know how hard it is and how we think that it'll never happen to us. And I was inside my home. And she was talking about the neighbor who attacked her. So it's something that we naturalize violence that we didn't deal very much with. So marriages are full of sexual violences, and we have to look not only in the dimension of effective relationship between men and women, but also regarding children. And the third point is omission. When we omit, and that's not just to delegate the responsibility, so go there and make a denunciation, that's their responsibility. No, we all can be part, and the part is to look, to make the hearing a qualified hearing, to be there, available. They will tell you 1, 2, 3, 5, 40 times the same thing, but for you it is 40 times. For her, it's the first time she talks about another thing that happened to her. It's very important to hear well. As public institutions, we have a responsibility. As with private institutions, each one of us is in a place, and we are responsible for that institutional place. We have established a contract, and whether this contract is private, but there is a social contract that establishes a relationship with society, and we have the responsibility to look at that. Arielle is one of the leaders of entrepreneurial coalition against violence against women and female children. It is fundamental that we looked at private institutions and say, listen, it's our responsibility to have a fight against sexual violence. It's our responsibility to serve and to consider and bring the best welfare situation. And lastly, how do we change culture? Well, we have to stop treating violence as a taboo. Let's talk about it. Let's make mistakes. Let's be correct. But the more we talk about it, we take the monstrosity of this violence. It's very important to look at this so that we do not lose this dimension. I think to close, these are the points. And I would like to leave a space for you to thank, and I want to thank both of you, Renata, Bruno, Fernando, Jovan, Douglas. I tried to cover all the questions that you sent, Everaldo, Patricia, Renata, Cesar. There were a whole load of questions. Thank you very much, Gabriela. Thank each one of you who brought these questions to this debate with open ears. It's not an issue of us just building places again, building things. We're building new places. We're not putting the culprit onto someone, especially. Arielle and Anna, I knew it. I'm totally in love and an admirer of you two. I knew what was coming. Thank you, not only for this conversation, but for your dedication. And thank you for using your voice, and your knowledge for us to accelerate transformations that are really necessary. Arielle, I'd like you to make your final thanks and closures. And I have a surprise for you to show to you the result of this conversation. Thank you very much for your words and for valuing this conversation. I'd like to thank Samira, Renato, all the Brazilian Forum for the invitation and for this space to make visible this theme that is so relevant and that is very dear to me, and I know it's very dear to you too. I'm available to continue this conversation in all the other spaces, because this conversation does not finish here at all. This was just a tiny bit of what we still have to talk, think, produce, and I hope to meet you in the other spaces so that we continue to think of solutions. And I like to say that I'm totally available. I would also like to thank you very, very much to be here with you, Arielle. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Samira Bueno here from the Forum. She's my partner in the writing of the book. I always send Samira to seek for data and surveys and information. And I would like to treat each space like this as an opportunity for us to change, think. I think to change the world, something so distant, but really we are changing the world now with small things that I would like to hand over to my child. She's 14. It was a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you. I also thank Samira, Renato, Juliana for the invitation. The Brazilian Forum is a first degree, a top partner for violence against women and children, and something so important that is public security. I thank you very much for bringing this space to us, or us to the space, bringing this area, which is very complex, sexual abuse. Thank you very much for the possibility of going forward. As Arielle Faro, this conversation never stopped today, and it didn't stop today. There is a journey, which is like a marathon, and I hope that we can really deliver a better world. And I didn't know if you saw this, but I am in home office, and my 3-year-old child was going back and forth here. And I hope they have healthier relationships that are not based in violence processes, because at the end of the day, it's not just facing the violence, but creating relationships that can make it possible for us to live our lives at full. We're still in the process of looking at violences that have already happened, and I don't want to look at that so much. Violence isn't part of what we have to think, and that way we can exercise and execute who we are. I'd like to show you the result of this conversation. My surprise to you, I'd like to introduce to you our graphic facilitator, Eloisa, who's here to show what came out of this conversation that you helped build. Hello. It's hard because each theme unveiled, and I registered up to half the main talks, but many things didn't fit. At the right, hi there is the discussion from Ari that violence goes much beyond rape. It could be touching, harassment, online harassing, and at the left, at the top, violence is ingrained in the lives of all women. It reflects on justice. It reproduces the victimization and the guilt of the victim. You didn't take care, it says. And the importance of hearing and help networks, aid networks of the family and the work of the police. And here below, at the right, how difficult it is to make a denunciation, and it's very hard for a man's word to be questioned, and education for prevention for children. Beautiful, beautiful, incredible. It was marvelous, Eloisa. That's what it is. That's what it is. It's really cool, Eloisa. Thank you for your capacity of summarizing and bringing up the central points of this discussion. Yeah, that's what it is. So we're here for today. I thank you again for this moment, and we still have 4 event days in the forum, and there are many good things to talk about and bridges to be built. Enough walls. We have to come out of this logics of we against them and build up a logic that we're all part of the problem, we're all part of the solution, therefore. Good night, good evening. Thank you all.
Finito?
Finito. Paulo tá aí? Ok, Paulo.
Sim.
Então foi isso. Desculpa aquele negócio. A coisa caiu e quando eu tentei atualizar, eu entrei na parte errada. Depois me orientaram, acabei entrando direitinho. No fim
Não,
deu certo,
sem problema.
né?
Tranquilo.
Tá. Sempre coisa de lei. Tá bom. Só para a gente aproveitar aqui rapidinho, acho que não vai incomodar ninguém. A nossa programação próxima é dia 8 amanhã, onde você entra às 19 até às 20h15, tá certo?
Tá joia. Fechado.
Os outros 2 vão ser feitos pelo Júlio, tá? Pelo Júlio comigo. Eu vou passar essas orientações para ele, tá bom?
Beleza.
Okay.
Até amanhã,
Legal,
então. Lá pelas
até
6
amanhã.
6 e pouquinho a gente deve estar online, hein? Começa que horas mesmo?
6 e pouquinho a
7h30?
gente
7 horas.
entra.
É 7, né?
Às
Começa.
7. 19 horas.